Good morning. How are you all? I am so impressed. I'm a college professor, and I was trying to think early on as I was coming in and seeing this crowd on a sunny Saturday morning. What would it take to get my undergraduates to see me talk about anything on a sunny Saturday morning? I could not think of a single thing. I am so impressed that such a broad swath, such a broad cross-section of the community would want to come out and see we guys who are still trying to get our undergraduates to come out on weekdays to see us, but certainly to come out and hear, discuss, contemplate such, I think, important and weighty issues that we have on our table today in regard to the past of this country, and in regard to the present and future. As a historian, we tend to have the long view, and certainly we use the rearview mirror to try to make sense. That is, we benefit from the hindsight of the past, or we have the benefit of reading the past with the hindsight of the present. But the idea that, again, so many people would come out on I'm humbled and thankful that you all, as a community, see the gravity, the importance of these issues, and seek knowledge, and seek a space, a venue to fellowship in regard to what we might learn and what we might seek to improve ourselves in regard to. I want to thank the organizers. I want to certainly thank James Williams, Renee Price, Dr. Parker, who organized this particular panel, and all the other invisible labor, all the other people who were involved in organizing this event and bringing it together. I want to thank them. I think it's timely that we are historically minded as a nation, as a people. History is the best teacher, I think. Everything has a history. I don't think that history repeats itself. I think Mark Twain says it doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. It is easy to fall into the traps of our past if we do not study it. So again, thank you so much for coming out, especially when I'm certainly sure that all of you could have easily found other things to do on such a gorgeous, a bit brisk day here in early February. My talk today will engage a few things. I think it complements Professor Brundage's very thoughtful presentation and commentary about lynching. So hopefully there's not too much overlap as I sketch out some of the general backdrop to the specifics of my talk, but I think it complements a lot of the, again, great things that Professor Brundage has said. The other portion of the talk is primarily about the book that I wrote, about a lynching that took place in Salisbury, Rowan County. Rowan County is on the way to Charlotte. If you're going down 85, you would pass through Rowan County. It's about 40 minutes from Charlotte. I was born there in Salisbury, raised there. I was there until I was a teenager. My family moved to Charlotte, and I still have a lot of family in Rowan County. So I consider it home, although I lived in a number of other places, the Midwest, in addition to now in Durham. But Salisbury is still home. That's my origin. Again, I have a lot of family members who are still there. So my book was on a lynching that took place in Salisbury in 1906. I sort of stumbled upon the topic, which I'll talk about in a moment, how I stumbled upon it. But the book was about that. It came out in 2010. And it's a proper history of this lynching that took place. But since then, it has, having written the book and studied the time period and read other books and listened to our current discourse on a number of different things, including monuments and so forth, it's made me think more about what happened in Salisbury in our particular historical moment in which people are grappling with history, whether they're grappling with history in this sort of way and in a room like this and listening to presentations, and hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A, or whether it's our students grappling with monuments on our campus and trying to figure out what these things represent and why they are there. Whether we're grappling with the nature of our politics and our partisanship as a people. So again, having the benefit of hindsight, having written the book, but having also the opportunity to reflect on the past and the present, my talk is somewhat sort of the standard historian's talk to a lay audience, but also some stream of consciousness in regard to reflections that I currently have about our particular moment. So I'll get started. There's a book that came out in the year 2000. It was called Lynching Photography in America. It's a hard-covered book. I think appropriately it has a black dust jacket on it. And more or less it's a collection of photographs of lynchings. They were photographs taken by cameramen who were around, collections of postcards. And that was sort of a cottage industry of postcards. People would go to lynchings and they would take pictures and then they'd have them printed on postcards and by the thousands. And they'd be sent out through the mails and so forth, giving long-distance relatives and friends and colleagues a chance more or less to visually participate in the lynching. That is to witness the lynching in miniature and sort of imagine what it was like to be there. People literally did that. So thumbing through this book, it's sort of more a book that's kind of a violent pornographic book, insofar as there are images that are just perhaps we weren't meant to see, and they brutalize the viewer, just witnessing the images. But I think the book is a necessary, or was a necessary endeavor. It, among other things, helps us not to forget. That is, the visual truth behind the images reminds us that this happened and that it could happen. And it did happen in this place in the world. So I'm thumbing through the book, and on every page there's a couple of these images, or there'll be a full page of a single image, and under it would be the inscription of where it was from and if there was a date. And sometimes they might have the names of the victims. So thumbing through it, Texas and Alabama and Nevada and Minnesota, Florida. I don't know if there was a state that was not represented. Maybe there were one or two states, but most states had representations of people in these pictures. And of course, there were those states, and as Professor Brun just said, across the Sun Belt of states, or in another parlance, the Deep South Black Belt of states, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and so forth, that were overrepresented, or they were disproportionately represented. I can still remember as if it had happened a few moments ago, coming across one of the images. It was image number 12. And the image was a triple lynching of 3 black males. I wouldn't say black men. One looked really young, and I learned later that he was young. He was a boy, he was underage. He was less than 18. Hanging from a tree in sort of an odd arrangement of these individuals. It wasn't the most grotesque of the pictures, but it was certainly a striking picture insofar as it was a triple lynching, and one of the victims was a very young person. And I can remember, as my habit was in flipping through the pictures, looking at the subtitle, Salisbury, North Carolina, August 1906. And if you've ever had a moment in which you sort of felt suspended and out of time, I can remember audibly gasping when I saw that. And I'll say more about that in a moment, but just to give you the particulars in regard to the background to the lynching and what happened. On the night of July 13th, 1906, Isaac Lowerly, his wife Augusta, and 2 of their children were killed in their sleep by intruders who were wielding axes. Their home in Rowan County, North Carolina was then set on fire. but two of their children escaped and were able to get to the neighbors and tell them about the tragedy. Immediate suspicion fell upon a number of local African Americans who had previously worked for the Lyerly family, but had fallen out about wages or something of that nature. Arrest followed the next day, and the suspects were taken secretly to Charlotte, which almost certainly spared them a lynching at the Rowan County Jail. A mob came to the jail that night looking for those suspects who, again, had been secretly carted off to the Mecklenburg County Jail in Charlotte, North Carolina. The suspects were returned to Salisbury in August of 1906, a month following the axe murders of the Lyerly family. On the night of August 6, 1906, following grand jury indictments of the suspects, three of them, Niece Gillespie, James Gillespie, and Jack Dillingham, were taken by a mob from the county jail and lynched before a crowd estimated to be in the thousands. A bit of historical context, and again, this is the place I think that my talk will meshes with, again, the really rich context that Professor Brundage laid out earlier. In the grand scheme of things, there was not very much that was unique about the lynching in Salisbury in 1906. Beyond the fact that it was a multiple killing, you had multiple people murdered, three victims of the lynch mob, and it happened in a state that prided itself on being a New South state, that is North Carolina. That is, it was not Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama where these things happened with much more frequency. Lynching actually peaked in the 1890s, with the majority of the victims being black, and on average 139 lynchings taking place every year of that decade. So if you were living in the 1890s and you read the newspaper or kept your ear to the grapevine, you would have likely heard about a lynching 2 or 3 a week every year. It was one of those things you had to factor into your experience. Things such as we factor into our experiences now, poverty or disease or natural disaster and so forth, things that are bad, tragic, awful things, but because of their frequency, we simply have to, somewhat like gun violence and mass shootings and so forth, that we are awful. It should not become normal to us, but it does happen. And next week or the next month, expect to hear further news about some sort of awful tragedy regarding gun violence. Lynching operated like that in the 1890s. That is, it was common enough for people to expect that next week or next month you're going to hear news about this. White on black lynchings were meant to clearly demarcate or mark out racial lines. That is, to mark out the do's and don'ts of Southern race relations, where lines of etiquette, lines of power and privilege existed, and for everyone to clearly see those highlighted lines. That's what lynchings were designed to do. They are a piece of what was going on in the late 19th century. As Professor Brundage was saying, this is after the collapse of Reconstruction, which was an experiment following Civil War, which ends in 1865. This Reconstruction period, by its name, to reconstruct, to put back together, but it was an experiment in expanding American citizenship, especially to African Americans. I think an admirable experiment, one that was incomplete, one that was under assault for the duration of the experiment, lasting into the late 1870s. So the rise in especially white on black or racialized lynching is part of the end game of, or the collapse of this experiment in African American citizenship led by the federal government or Reconstruction. The rise of Jim Crow or segregation is also contemporaneous with the rise in lynching. This is also the period in which African American men are stripped of the right to vote state by state by state, about different machinations that the states are putting into place, such as poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses and on and on and on, to make sure that African American men, and it was African American men who were enfranchised by the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, could not vote, could not hold office, and so forth. And lynching, again, is part of that larger puzzle in which there are things being put in place to reinscribe white supremacy in all realms of life. And if it wasn't enough for the segregationist laws that were coming into being, the disfranchisement laws that were keeping people from the ballot box, and other things to draw these lines of power between the subjugated and the rulers, or those who would have privilege, white privilege, lynching was the final exclamation mark in regard to where those lines were. So, in some instances, lynchings had very little to do with guilt, with whether or not one had committed a crime. In some instances, although as Professor Brundage, it was often the case that those who were lynched had been accused of a crime. Often that was beside the point. There was a larger message that was being conveyed by the lynchers, and more or less it's one about privilege and powerlessness. That is, there are people in the community who have the power to take the lives of other people in the community for whatever reasons, and the law would not step in and serve as recourse for those who were victimized in that sort of way. A bad place for anyone to be, in a place that prided itself on the rule of law. That sort of possibility of falling into the hands of the mob for whatever reason, or little or no reason, is terroristic. That is, it terrorized not only the individual, the hapless person who fell into the hands of the mob, but the whole community of African Americans was terrorized. Sort of the randomness of it. And that's the way that terror operates. It's not just as directed toward the individual, it's directed largely, it's a messaging to a larger class, a larger group of people, and the randomness of it generalizes the terror, I think. And lynchings were meant in many instances to operate in that sort of way. This is increasingly something that happens to black people. It is perpetuated by members of the white community, and the law is not going to intercede on behalf of victims of lynchings. Many lynchings were triggered, or as Professor Brundage said, I think very appropriately, the pretext for them could be very minor things. It could be things that wouldn't ordinarily be punishable as capital offenses, as things that were punishable by the death penalty, particularly if the culprit was white. You could be lynched for things such as disrespectful, boastful, or perceived to be threatening behavior or language towards whites. Resisting assault by whites could get you lynched. Disorderly conduct, drunkenness, petty theft, conspicuously looking at or smiling at a white woman, or being accused of doing such. Turning state's evidence, or refusing to turn state's evidence, whatever the case was about. Joining a labor union, or any sort of labor agitation, questioning the landowner about your wages or your portion of the crop if you were a sharecropper. Any of those sorts of things might lead you in a bad direction in regard to the lynch mob. Attempting to vote was one of the things that I think people learned early on during the Reconstruction period. And actually, Reconstruction, which lasts roughly a decade from the mid-1860s to the 1870s, there was probably more violence and things that we might even call lynchings during that decade than all of the decades from roughly 1880 through the civil rights period of the 1950s. It's just not well documented. But if you were to look at congressional investigations of the Ku Klux Klan, which comes into being in the 1870s, or look at what Friedman are telling congressional investigations in the 1870s about Klan violence, or to look at a number of reports that we have that exist from the 1860s and 1870s, as fragmented as they are, there's a low-intensity war going on in the South against freed people, African Americans, after the Civil War, more or less to reinvent slavery, to turn back the clock on emancipation. And again, we don't have the numbers. We can't know for sure how many people were killed during Reconstruction in the aftermath of the end of slavery. I think it would be fair to say the numbers in the thousands. And I think it'd be fair to say it at least rivals the number of people that we have documented evidence were lynched, which approaches about 5,000 people in and of itself. Other things that could get you lynched, refusing to relinquish your property to whites could get you lynched. Or just being financially successful in a community might turn the envious eyes of your white neighbors, community members, the mob in your direction. One of the things that was unique about lynchings by the turn of the 20th century, by let's say the year 1900. One of the things that was new, and there's a lot of things that make lynching as a phenomena peculiarly American. There's no other country in the world in which we have the phenomena of lynching, that is private individuals collectively taking the lives of other private individuals over such a long period of time and in such numbers. You know, if you look at Russia and what it did to its Jews at this time period, that's the state mostly in operation. Apartheid South Africa is mostly the state doing this. Even Nazi Germany, it's the state that's carrying out this sort of thing. It's not private individuals. It's not, you know, your neighbors or the landowner and so forth being allowed. These things did occur, but in regard to the frequency and the sheer volume, the numbers, it's a uniquely American phenomena in regard to, again, the frequency and the duration of lynchings. So in addition to that uniqueness about lynchings, another thing that was fairly new, although we do see this in earlier times, was the sort of public exhibitionism behind lynching. That is the public spectacle, the theater that takes place, the ritual, the ritualized nature of lynchings by roughly the year 1900. It wasn't enough just to kill people. It wasn't enough just, in many instances, it wasn't enough just to take a life. It was the case, and this was the case in the Salisbury instance that I wrote about, that the mob needed to show their work to the larger public. That is, they need to do this in the city square. There was a lynching tree that everyone knew about and knew what time to go there. There were lynchings that were, or prospective lynchings that were pre-advertised in the local newspaper. This train will bring you here at this time to see the lynching. Of course, the press, the photographers knew where to come to take those pictures, to make those postcards and so forth. Okay, so this was a community event in many instances, a lynching. And there's a literature in regard to why that becomes the case and why the crowd comes. Perhaps this is the sort of the trope in regard to car accidents. That is, the average one of us does not want to see bad things happen to other people. But if we pass by a car accident, we look. We might even gaze, right? I don't know how many are automobile fans who look at NASCAR. What gets shown on the late night news is not the car going around the track 200 times. No, it's the awful accident that they show several times in slow motion to make sure we caught it, right? Maybe that's going on in regard to the crowd that shows up for lynchings. That is, to see the unusual, even the tragically startling, and so forth. But that is certainly something that marks many, not all, but many lynchings by the early 1900s, or even 1890s. This need to show the work of the lynchers, the mob, and so forth in a public spectacle fashion. And again, lynchings are captured on film. They're photographed and so forth, and many of those images are circulated in the post, in the federal mail, until 1910, when the federal government, perhaps embarrassed by the circulation of these images in a country that prided itself on being democratic and a free country ruled by the rule of law, made it illegal to do so. Another thing about the lynchings of this time period is the diversity of the violence. Most people, or perhaps a plurality of people, the average person who was lynched was done so or done in by the embrace of a noose. But it was also the case there were people who were shot, who were flogged, who were dragged behind trucks and automobiles, sexually abused, dismembered, you name it, whatever torture you could imagine that people could come up with. Those are the sorts of things that happened at lynching bees, as they were called, or at the hands of the lynch mob. People were abducted before and after trial from the local jail. People were lynched during every time of the day, every month of the year. Felonious crimes such as murder and rape were often cited by lynchers as cause of their actions, though the rash and extralegal nature of lynchings allowed little opportunity to conclusively determine guilt or innocence. Back to the Salisbury story, which I focused on in my book. There was much public and editorial outrage about the lynchings that took place in 1906. Governor Robert Glenn pushed for the arrest of suspected lynchers, even offering a reward, and succeeded in getting one of the lynchers prosecuted and imprisoned, which was the first in North Carolina history in 1906. Lynchings would decline in North Carolina after this episode, largely due to speedier trials and more liberal usage of the electric chair, especially in cases of blacks accused of capital crimes against whites. So you can almost chart this. That is, as lynchings in North Carolina are declining, the use of the capital punishment in North Carolina is going up. Again, an inverse relationship. Also, efforts by groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, activists like Ida B. Wells Barnett publicized lynchings and encouraged future governors in North Carolina and elsewhere to be more vigorous in the suppression of the mob and its passions. Finally, concerns over the state's image and whether or not this being a terrain in which racial violence took place, lynchings took place, would scare away capital, would scare away investment, would scare away businesses. And it often did. If nothing else, we know that corporations and capital liked stability. No one wants to invest in a community in which your property might be threatened by the mob or is known for outbreaks of violence. So the state, local officials and so forth who were solicitous of the investment of outsiders, of northern industrialists and so forth, thought lynching gave the state a bad name. And there was great pressure from public officials to do something about it. My book, in common with Professor Brundage, one, it demonstrated just a lack of knowledge that people at the time living on the site of the lynching had about their own past. That is, people simply did not know in Salisbury that there was a triple lynching in 1906. And it's at a site that you pass by every day on the way to the grocery store to visit relatives and so forth. And that it was at a time when race relations were being arranged in a certain time, in certain ways that the privileges of which and the disadvantages of which reverberate to this present day. People just didn't know. So I was struck by not so much the question of memory, but some process of forgetting that had taken place in Salisbury. My mother, who still lives there, and when I learned about this lynching and reading this book, she'd never heard of it. She's born and raised in Salisbury. She'd never heard of it. I asked some of my aunts, Who knew? You know, as far as they were concerned, they knew nothing about this lynching. So it's at some point in Salisbury, and I imagine that many other communities across the South and wherever lynchings took place or some horrible tragedies, there was some sort of implicit process in which the white community and the black community, perhaps separately but somewhat in complicity, stopped talking about this or decided that this was not something for public discourse or for public conversation. After all, when something like this happens in the community, some event like this disfigures a community's sense of self and whatever cohesion it might have had, how do you go on the next day? How do you go back to that sharecropper's property and work? How do you, as a maid, go back into that white owner's house? You can't talk about this stuff. This has to be under the carpet. This has to be under the rug. So there is a sort of purposeful process of forgetting that takes place, I think, that allows for these communities to have stability, but not necessarily equity or justice and so forth. But in order for things to approach a sort of normality, a certain sort of stability, people just didn't talk about them anymore. Perhaps, I'm sure this was the case, there were black parents after the fact and before the fact of a lynching who would tell their children, you don't do this, you don't do this, you don't say this to white people, you don't look at people like this, you don't look at people in the eye, you get off the sidewalk. So black parents, there's a whole legacy of them protecting their children from what they knew might happen to them in their innocence, in their approach to the world. But in regard to particular episodes and the episodes that took place in Salisbury, and actually I learned in 1902 there had been a lynching in Salisbury involving two young boys who were accused of killing a white woman, and they were lynched. So in the space of 4 years, 1902 and 1906, there were 5 people lynched in Salisbury, which more or less made it the lynch capital of North Carolina in the 20th century. But again, no public memory, no public discourse, no markers or anything like that. There's some subterranean memory. There are people in Salisbury that I've come across who know the sort of vague outlines. If you go to the public library, you can find files on the Lyerly family and on this lynching. So there's a sort of subterranean memory consciousness there, but it's just that. It's not something that the public is really aware of. You'd have to really be interested in this and know to go in the library to look for these things to know that they are there. Public reaction to my book in Salisbury has been interesting, I'd have to say, and I'll wrap up with this. The book came out in 2010. The silence in the local press was deafening, and which is I had not anticipated the reaction. It wasn't the case that no one in Salisbury knew the book came out, because the book was reviewed in the Greensboro paper, in the Raleigh paper, in the Charlotte paper, and so forth. But the Salisbury Post decided not to review the book or even to mention it for several years after the fact. I have my own thoughts about that, and I'm happy to share them after the talk. But that was a decision, and again, I think it's a decision that's linked to this earlier sort of implicit decision of forgetting, even when it's right in your face, the need to circumvent it or go around it, that the press was making, and perhaps the press was making on behalf of the community, and the community was making, and so forth. I was contacted last year, or actually in 2017, by a pastor, Presbyterian pastor in Salisbury, who her group wanted to commemorate the lynchings that took place in Salisbury, and they wanted to have some sort of public discussion. They wanted to have some sort of process of healing in Salisbury. And I was invited to participate in a program that they hosted on the 111th anniversary on August 6, 2017. And they plan to create a marker for the lynching, where the lynching took place. They also wanted the Salisbury City Council to recognize the lynching that took place in 1906 and actually to create a commission that would look into racial inequities in the city. Their proposals, as you might imagine, were met with a good amount of contentiousness and skepticism in the local press and I think in the local community, but much of the debate was played out in the local press and the Salisbury Post. There are voices on all sides raised. These are complicated things. If I haven't learned anything else, these are really complicated matters, even though this is something that happened outside the lifetime of anybody here and anywhere else. Again, this lynching took place 112 years ago. So if we have anyone here 112, congratulations, first of all, and that person would have only been an infant at the time. So even though the victims and the perpetrators and the witnesses are all no longer with us, the gravity, I've learned just the gravity of the issues are still, it's like the Civil War. It's 150 years old, but there are people still drawing battle lines in regard to these things. So that was one thing that came out in regard to the newspaper engagement with what this group was trying to do. And just to look at the voices, there were those people who thought that the mentioning of the lynchings gave them an opportunity to bring out all of the other long-standing grievances about race and inequality and so forth in Salisbury that were also sort of under the rug or under the carpet. And there were those who I think saw this as opportunities to sort of get this thing on the table, talk about it as quickly as you can, get the resolution from the city council, and then let's go back to normal. I think that was one of the sentiments that came out. That is okay, since the thing is out of the bag, let's do this and get it over with, and let's move on into the 21st century. And then there are those whose view was this is ancient history. This happened might have well been 1,000 years ago. There are no perpetrators with us anymore. There are no victims. There are no witnesses. Why would anybody bring this up? And of course, the question, the motives of the historians and others. Why would you bring this up, but for you're trying to make Salisbury look bad, or you're trying to make us look bad, or you're trying to make us feel guilty, and so forth. So there is a certain defensiveness too, in regard to people thinking that looking at this history implicates them in some way, and also wanting to disconnect us from history. And we're all in history. You can't disconnect yourself from history. But wanting to say that 1906 it might as well have happened on Mars. That has nothing to do with 2017, 2018, 2019, which again, is sort of an interesting way of thinking about the world. I've probably gone on too long as it is, Professor. Thank you for listening, folks. Thanks for coming out again. I appreciate the invitation.